What's up, everybody? My name is Jacob Hardison, and today let's talk about bump steer. Welcome back, everybody, to, of course, the lovely Adrenaline RC YouTube channel, where today we're going to be talking about bump steer. Now, being that the word steer is in the name, it does directly affect the front end of our vehicle, and of course, how the steering geometry gets changed as the vehicle compresses on the front. So typically, under braking, as your front end is being loaded, what those front two tires are going to do. So bump steer is going to be what happens as the car goes through the actual stroke of the suspension. Now, here in front of me is, of course, my associated e-buggy, and with this buggy, I can make a very quick change that isn't necessarily directly a bump steer change, but the bump steer is a change that is affected by moving this upper arm. So I can show you guys more bump steer versus less bump steer. Now, for me personally, when I say more, I refer to that as when I'm going through the suspension, the tires are going to toe out more. And then when I say more bump in or less bump out, I typically refer to that as the tire staying either more centered or actually even potentially becoming towed in. So I'll have a much easier idea or a much easier visual representation today with this. I will move the camera around, get a good picture of the front end, show you guys what the bump steer change looks like and kind of what to look for on the car itself. Then we'll come back to this view and I'll go over what those changes are actually going to do when you hit the track, what the car is going to feel like, and when you'll typically see those changes. Because obviously, as we know with our setup stuff, you usually see a group of geometry settings for a smooth or high grip track, and then there's a slightly different set of settings that are standard for a more bumpy or loose track per se. So without further ado, we'll start out with, like I said, showing you the visual end of things of what bump steer looks like on the car itself. Then we'll swap back here and I'll go over what all it does. All right, so here we are with my buggy out in front of us. And as you can see, I've removed my upper arm shims. That way I can manipulate the arm, which is going to change the caster, which will change our bump steer. Now, once I actually show what's going on here, I'm going to pull this off and then explain the different changes and why those changes affect the bump steer. But for just a general visual of being able to understand what the bump out or bump in is, we can see my steering rack is nice and centered there. Hope you can see that in the video. So with our arm all the way forward, as we push down, you can see that we have toe out come into the vehicle. So here's our neutral, and at full compression, you can see the front of the tire comes out, the back of the tire comes in a little bit, which gives us that toe out. Now, if I move this back, which effectively lowers this guy, you'll see that my overall toe at neutral doesn't change, but when I compress it, there's a significantly less amount of toe out gain. It stays much more neutral throughout the stroke, as you can see. So again, arm forward, which effectively raises this link. We have a lot of toe gain on the toe out. If I move this back, our overall toe stays about the same. Compress, and you can see that it stays much more neutral, comparatively speaking, throughout our stroke. So now that I've been able to give that visualization, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this tire off and explain what's actually changing in here and why that is changing our bump steer. Now we've got the tire off, we can actually see what is changing in the vehicle itself. So I'll go ahead and compress this up just that way it's a little bit easier to see on the camera itself. But right now we've got the arm all the way back. Keep a note on the location that we have of this pivot point. So when we push that forward, you can see the change that that makes to our linkage here. So what effectively changes our bump steer is going to be the angle of this link here. So you can see with the arm all the way back, this link lowers. With this arm all the way forward, the link raises. Now, what you're seeing here is that as we're adjusting our caster, this is a byproduct of adjusting our caster. In true reality, if you wanted to adjust just the angle of this link, you could do that by adding or taking away washers here or here, which is going to change the angle of this. But the reason why it was important to show you that the caster also changes that is because that changes where this sits. So even though maybe you're doing a caster change for some other purpose, a byproduct of something that you have to check is going to be the height of this link here. For a lot of changes you make on the front end, it will affect your bump steer. Now, if you take your shock, for example, and just move it from the outside hole to the inside hole, in that case scenario, that's not going to affect your bump steer. But on something like a pillball car, moving this upper arm to adjust your caster, or if you're on a C-hub car, actually adjusting your caster block, that will change the height of this. Another thing on a C-hub car, as you adjust your kick-up, that will also affect this angle here. So pretty much anytime you make any sort of like steering geometry change or change to like your block or your overall caster, it's good to go ahead and check to make sure your bump steer doesn't change ultra dramatically depending on what change you're making. Now, in some cases, it'll be a very minor change of what your bump steer changes. Some cases it's more aggressive, and it will vary a little bit from car to car, just depending on what your base height of your linkage out here and in here truly is. So your steering rack and then all of your knuckle and block pieces, or uprights in this case, can affect your bump steer. Now, one thing that I'm not going to necessarily give a 100% on is that on some cars, adjusting the angle on this will do different things just because each car's overall front geometry setup may be different, or maybe something on your particular car's geometry will be different. So on some sheets, you'll see, increasing the angle or decreasing the angle does X, Y, Z. Because it is kind of a car-to-car, setup-to-setup thing, this is something that I recommend you play with yourself. It's not something that you necessarily need to see on the track necessarily, but just on the bench, you can manipulate the different heights in here, manipulate your caster to some fashion, or your kick-up, depending on what car you're on, and see what it does for your car. Maybe you find out that more angle on your car gives more bump out, or you get the opposite effect. So it's important to make sure that for your car in particular, you know what it's going to respond with as you're making these changes. But now we've gone over the visual end of things, what's actually changing in here that's affecting our bump steer. We'll go ahead, we'll swap back, and we'll actually discuss what our bump steer is going to do on the car. All right, so now that we know visually what our bump steer looks like in the front, and we know what different changes on the front can affect our bump steer, let's now, of course, go over what bump steer is going to actually do on the car. Now, this is going to be fairly quick, I imagine. There's not a whole lot to it. So as we increase our bump out, meaning that as we compress the front, we're going to see the tires start to toe out. That is going to generally smooth out your steering. You'll notice, especially in that mid-corner area, while the front is as loaded as it's going to be, it's going to smooth out. You'll have a little bit less steering. It will feel smoother around the turn. It'll be easier to actually arc the turn and take it as a true sweep. And then the other thing you'll get with it as well is it's going to be a little bit more gentle on the chop because you don't have nearly as much steering angle on that outside tire. So having more bump out, increasing the toe as we compress the front end, is going to smooth the steering out, and it'll be easier to drive on a choppy track. Now, to swap over to bump in, meaning that when we compress our front, the tires are going to toe in more. They're going to be pointed more towards each other. Again, in that mid-corner area, under full compression, or the most compression where the front end is loaded, those tires toe in. You're going to notice that because the outside tire has some more turn in, comparatively speaking, you're going to get more mid-corner steering. The car can potentially scrub a bit more speed, so you might lose some of that smoothness around the turn. It's not going to want to arc nearly as much, and it's going to be something that you're going to generally see more on a smooth track because, again, with that outside tire turning in more, becoming more aggressive, it's more prone to potentially grabbing some of that chop around the track. So as a quick just overview of the two of them, generally speaking, having more bump out where the tires come out under compression, you'll smooth out the steering. And then as you have more bump in, meaning that under compression, the tires toe in more, you're gonna get generally a more aggressive car. Again, specifically more in that kind of mid-turn area. So now that we've gone over everything visually, all the different changes that could potentially affect it, and of course, now what it does, you guys are ready to hit the track knowing what this change does, and now you can use it to hopefully help you get a little bit faster at the track. If you have any questions or you want a more written version of this, definitely leave those down in the comment section below. Or if you have any questions or maybe recommendations for future videos that you want to see, same thing, leave those down below, and we'll see you guys in an all new video next week.